Blog Talk Radio.
Greetings and welcome to Igbo Radio. This is Onyemobi. Yeah, this is Onyemobi.
And I'm Akobando.
And this is Igbo Radio. Thank you for joining us on this Friday, September 18th, which is Afro Market Day in our traditional Igbo calendar. And I want to give you a little bit of information about Igbo Radio. Igbo is a show which hopes to foster the knowledge of the Igbo people, has a small imprint for a Pan-African global renaissance at hand, which resparks the flame blazing in the direction of a return to sacred indigenous ways with an awareness of the social, political, and psycho-spiritual blockages that keep us from truly living in balance. Today, is a very special show. We're going to be talking about the Igbo ancestry of Black America and the Caribbean. And we're going to be joined by a very special guest. His name is Dr. Douglas B. Chambers, the author of Murder at Montpelier, Igbo Africans in Virginia. And I consider him to be the foremost scholar on Igbo Diaspora studies. So we're going to go and let Dr. Chambers introduce himself and say a couple words about who he is and why, what sparked his interest in Igbo people. Dr. Chambers, are you there?
Kedu, Anyamobi, how are you?
Adima, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to join with you and have a conversation with you on Igbo Diaspora.
All right.
And I'm also flattered in how you characterized the modest work that I've managed to do to this point. It is absolutely true that Igbo are as important to American history as any other group, and American history broadly considered to include the Caribbean, but also American history specifically in that the cultural history of what became the United States.
Okay. Can you go into detail first about your educational background?
Sure. Well, I'm a professor, associate professor of African history at the University of Southern Mississippi. And I grew up in Virginia and went to the University of Virginia as an undergraduate and then graduate school. And in graduate school at the University of Virginia, I was very interested in colonial American history. And I was particularly interested in the world that produced James Madison and his Plantation, and so 18th century Virginia history, and in beginning to ask questions about the 18th century in Virginia, I came across something that had been widely known and widely recognized since the 1930s, and that is that in the slave trade to this one small part of the Atlantic world, that is colonial Virginia, that enslaved people from what is now eastern Nigeria were a large proportion of Africans taken to Virginia, something like 40%, right? So the question then becomes, what does that mean? And the more I looked into this question of what did it mean that some 4 out of 10, and this is actually a low number because it's quite higher than that, in fact, but roughly half of all Africans taken as slaves to Virginia came from one particular region in West Africa, which is Igbo land. What does that mean? What did that mean for the people who survived the Middle Passage? And what did that mean for the world that they created in the dire conditions of slavery, of course, but still the world they created? And this is what has guided my my work since in the last 20 years.
Okay. What made you interested in Igbo people in particular, above, any other ethnic group?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, Anyamobi, at first, it was entirely intellectual, purely the result of the accident of stumbling upon this connection. And then the more, and once I immersed myself then in the study of Igbo history and culture and society, I became in love with this culture and history, and then traveling to Nigeria, and I fell in love with the people. It's a marvelous world, and I'm so honored to have been, in effect, adopted into a part of the Igbo world.
Okay. Now, I understand that you were given a title in Igbo land, correct?
And this is true, Adinri.
Okay. Oh, Inri. Oh, okay. Yeah, I know a little bit about that. Isn't that right, Akobondo?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Me and Akobondo, my brother, both of us are Inri descendants. In fact, I believe it was actually at an Inri convention that you and my brother actually met and dialogued for the first time.
Absolutely, you're right. That's where we met in Dallas.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was an Inri Progress Union USA chapter meeting, and they had asked me to give the keynote address at the fundraiser, and I remember when you all came up and were so surprised, of course, because obviously I am a white American, but here's the beauty. That is, there is who you look like on the surface and then who you really are inside.
Yeah. And
so there's always the joy of discovering what someone is really like on the inside.
Yeah, exactly.
But at Inri, so they gave me a title at Inri, and my name is Okulunri Okaome.
Okay. What does that mean?
You tell me. Say it for me, and say it well, because of course my language is poor in Igbo.
Well, what is that?
Okulunri Okaome.
Okay, Okulunri.
Okulunri. Okay, who speaks for Inri said done. Okaome. And the title is Ife Umuna Umunri.
Okay.
That's a great honor, and one that I take very seriously, in fact. So at Unri, of course, people understand, appreciate, and know that there are these larger connections throughout the world. And when I was asked if I would take this title, I understood that it was very serious and forever, and brings responsibilities as well as opportunities to speak for Henri, to tell the story of Henri. But also, in the end, my friend, and this is absolutely true, and that is, I'm a historian.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I'm looking at a picture with the Eze Henri and Welani too, and I remember saying to him specifically, "Sir, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a poet. I'm a historian, and this is what I'm primarily interested in understanding history." But of course, history leads us, as I'm sure you know. I mean, Onyemobi, that history leads in every direction, and that's one of the beauties of it.
Okay. All right. Well, we actually have some callers. Some people are pretty eager to speak with you. Would you mind taking some calls?
I'll be happy to.
All right. Hold on. I'll call from 773. You're on the air.
Hello, Brother Onyemobi.
Hey, greetings.
Brother Chibueze from Chicago. How you doing?
I'm all right, brother. How are you doing?
I'm great. Professor Chambers, how you doing, sir?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, here's a question that I have. I've been on a path for the past, I want to say about maybe 2 to 3 years, maybe 5, on studying my ancestry. And I was able to go back to 1837 to my great-great-grandfather, who was born in Alabama, but both his mother and the father were born in Virginia.
Okay.
Now, I haven't actually come across any documentation as of yet as to prove my Igbo ancestry, which, I feel that I am because I work with a lot of Igbos, and every time they see me, they speak to me in Igbo. And they tell me I look like the typical Igbo man.
I hear that. Mm-hmm.
Now, so how can I go by obtaining, since my ancestors, my great-grandparents' father and mother both were from Virginia, is there a way that I can, because I know you did the research, how can I go by doing the research on them, grabbing the information from Virginia to trace them or link them to Igbo people?
Okay, first I commend you for getting back as far as you have already, 1837, and then actually jumping, to Virginia in that the generation of the grandparents there. Where in Virginia? Do you know the county that they were in?
That I haven't pinpointed the county, because I did a lot of research on what's called ancestry.com.
Sure.
And and all they state were on the census. I think it was 1880 census. It listed my great-great-grandfather, his name and place of birth, and it says mother and father's place of birth, and it says for both of them, his mother and father were from Virginia. And that's all I have been able to ascertain as of now.
I hear that. Sometimes what we have to do is we have to follow the white side, because in other words, to follow the owners, to follow backward in time the masters, and that's
okay.
And that's easier. And actually, as you will find out if you haven't already, that there were often then connections anyway, right? That family connections crossed that great divide of race. But once you now I'm speaking to you directly as a historian, it's not easy. But it is. But where there's a will, there's a way. And
right.
The first challenge is to you have to get to a county to find, and it's not easy. And I don't have an easy answer for you. However, in general, there's a high chance that in fact your ancestors were brought from Igbo land. And I can tell you stories of how people see Black Americans who look so familiar. And I can tell you myself, we have this idea that, some people I should say, have the idea that Africans all look the same. Of course, that's ridiculous, right? And there are different parts of even Atlantic Africa. People look very different in different areas. And in eastern Nigeria, in Igbo land, people look very familiar. I grew up in the South. I'm from the South. And people look very familiar. And it's the other way around, too. Igbo Nigerians who come to the U.S. and they see Black Americans in general, and they say, these are my people. They look like us. They look like
us. I get that a lot.
Onyemobi, don't you?
Yeah, I definitely do see a resemblance. Some famous people look like some of my relatives.
So I commend you and keep at it. Again, where there's a will, there's a way. You'll find these people, and then you just have to keep inching your way back in time.
Okay, great.
I hope that helps.
Great. Okay, I appreciate it, and keep up the good work. I commend you on excellent work you've done.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Let me tell a quick story on Onyemobi, because it touches this caller's point, and it's a story that I was told when I was in Memphis, Tennessee, and it was in the early 1980s. A Yoruba woman had and her husband, who was an academic, had come to Memphis and were there visiting, and his wife was then taken to the new big mall of Memphis that had just opened, right? And this white American hosting this Yoruba Nigerian woman who was there, and this is in the early 1980s. And as they spent their day in the mall of Memphis, her friend who was visiting became more and more anxious and more nervous. And finally, the American woman turned to her friend and said, dear, what is wrong? And she turned and she said, my God, they're all Igbo. It made her, it made her anxious, because this was not long after the Biafran War, I suppose. Not long. And maybe her own experience or her anxiety about being surrounded by people who she said they all are Igbo. Or no, she said they're all Igbo. Then what did she mean? Did she mean that Memphis is a majority black city? The Mall of Memphis had opened. It had probably the normal, maybe majority African American crowd and shopping in the day on Saturday, whatever. But to this Yoruba woman, did they look Igbo? Did they act Igbo? Was there some combination? But it's something that there's a mystery there, and there's also I think a clue or a sign of historical connection. Now we have to, and then I have to make this this other point, because history is not destiny, right? And also biology is not destiny. Culture is an independent variable. So we of course must be realistic, and people are not going to be something because they look like something.
Yeah.
And yet, that afternoon made this woman quite anxious and nervous. Because people look, I suppose, or people seem to be Igbo in Memphis in the 1980s.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So part of what I'm doing, much of what I'm doing is to try to make sense of these stories, right? There are all these dots, and I'm trying to connect the dots. And the more I work at it, and it's the nature of this, but the more one works at something, the more connections one sees, and the more dots get connected.
Yeah. what have you found out that's very interesting? You know, what are some of the things that are like, you know, things that you've uncovered that haven't really been talked about before?
Well, so much of what I would call American African history is still just barely being understood, and we're in part because often historians don't really know what they're seeing. They don't quite know what they're looking at, as well as what they're looking for. But little things. I have students. I live in southern Mississippi, not far from the Gulf Coast, and in the Deep South, and I have students even today who, for example, students, female students whose first name is Anika, and that's a name that shows up in historical records in Virginia, in Jamaica, in Barbados, in the Caribbean, particularly in places where Igbo were taken in significant numbers. And it's a name that also exists in, I think, Swedish. It's a Swede name. There was a tennis player in maybe the 90s, but in that language, it's really pronounced Annika. Okay? Anika, Neka, perhaps. We think how it would be transformed from Igbo into English. And in a world where names mean something, perhaps the fact that there is a female name, Anika, is also evoking an Igbo background. Very few things are straightforward, but it's the context that enables us to understand what we're trying to see. I always use the example of okra.
Okay.
Okra is a good example because of the old saying, you are what you eat. Okay. And okra is a vegetable grown from Senegal all the way down to Angola and beyond. Okra, which is known in every language, there's a name for okra. In Yoruba, Ilu, in Twi, in Nkrumah, in Kikongo, Ngombo. And what is the word for okra in Igbo? Okro. And brought into English as okra. Why do we call this vegetable, which is the Latin name Hibiscus esculentus, why do we call Hibiscus esculentus okra? Why don't we call it Ilu, Nkrumah, or any of the other dozens of names in dozens of languages from West Africa and Atlantic Africa? And then the answer, I would argue, is because it was Igbo people who brought at least the most common name for this vegetable. And in Southern American history, in the cultural history of the American South, okra is as Southern as you can get. And yet it's not just Southern. It's not just American. It's also not just, quote, African, or we would call it by some other name. There are other words and terms that are recognized as like deep South, deep Southern, like mojo. Mojo, and it has come through the blues and taken on a life of its own in popular culture. Mojo, and mojo means a spirit. And where does this word come from? There's no word mojo, but in Igbo there's monjo, bad spirit, evil spirit, the thing itself, the spirit thing itself. Is that an accident? Or is that, in fact, another clue to historical connection? It's a lot of speculation, but it's speculation grounded in real things. And because here's the reality. The reality is that people were brought into the diaspora as slaves, and they had to survive, and they did survive, and everywhere in the Americas, the masters never gave the people enough to eat, never gave them enough to clothe themselves, never gave them enough to shelter themselves. People survived because they drew on their own knowledge. They drew on their own knowledge they brought with them, and also the strength of bringing the spirits with them across the Atlantic as well. And so the different regional cultures that people created reflected different regional histories, right? And those regional histories extend to different regions of Atlantic Africa as well. But nowhere, or hardly anywhere, were people able to reconstruct the lives that they had lived before, because, after all, it was a totally different world, and a world of slavery. And so one mistake that in the past that people have made is to try to look for those things in the diaspora that are exactly the same as at home, as in the homeland. Right? Except that's looking that's looking for the wrong thing, because we're not likely to find exactly the same. People could not simply reconstruct their lives. Even Maroons, runaways who escaped slavery and then created lives independently in the mountains or in the swamps or in the backcountry. Even they were not able to entirely reconstruct the multi-layered, the reality of life in its full totality, because it was a different situation. So we should not expect to find things that are exactly the same. What we should expect to find are things that are derived from, right? That foods and how you cook food and how you also make things, how you name things, how you heal things, how the gods operate, how the spirit world operates, assumptions about the nature of life. These are soft things, but also we should expect to find, and we do find, like the descendant institutions. Now, sometimes they're more transparent. For example, in Cuba today, there are 3 living African traditions, religions. One derived from the Yoruba, one derived from the Congo, basically, and one derived from, quote, the Calabars, or Caribali, as they say in Cuba, which included Igbo. And what it is, Onyemobi, and to your listeners, is called Ogbako. Ogbako. And it is precisely a combination of Epe from the eastern edges of Igbo land and Okonko and men's masquerade society. It's not the same, but it is clearly descended from an ancestral institution. Well, I tend to talk, I'm a professor. You get me started, I get going. Let's have another question from a listener.
Okay. Akabondo is Akabondo. Do you have who's the co-host? Do you have any questions?
Well, yeah, one.
First of all, Akabondo, hello. Say hello, my friend.
Oh, hello. How you doing?
I'm great.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. I'm doing good myself. I was reading some of your work, some of your great works, and I read that 60% of all African Americans have an Igbo ancestor. And I want to know. Yeah, I want to know. Can you go more in detail about that?
Okay. What I would say is that I would estimate that about 60% of Black Americans are likely to have had at least one Igbo ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because of the importance of Igbo in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. In the 18th century, the region called the Chesapeake. Mm-hmm. And the importance of the Chesapeake in American history, and part of that, the importance of the Chesapeake in American history, is that the people themselves were able to reproduce themselves. It's this crazy thing to say, what an achievement, but this is, in fact, in the world history of slavery, there are very few examples of a population of enslaved people who successfully reproduced themselves, where there was natural growth, right? Natural population, positive population growth, and this was the case in the Chesapeake. And so, from a very relatively small population, like we're talking maybe 25, depending, let's say 30 to 40,000 people, Igbo, brought to Virginia, maybe as many as 50,000 altogether. And out of 50,000, which would be about half of a relatively small population. I don't like to get all hung up with numbers. But from a relatively small population grew to millions of people. And over not that many generations, in fact. And so there is good evidence to suggest that a lot of African Americans have at least one Igbo ancestor. And this is probably one of the reasons why Black Americans look so familiar to Igbo Nigerian and to Igbo in general.
Okay. We actually have another call on the line. Call from 773. You're on the air?
Yeah, it's me again, Brother Oyemobi.
Hey, how you doing, brother?
Yeah, it's me. Thank you. Yeah, I'm doing fine. Professor Chambers, you touched on some of the cultures of African Americans, especially in the Deep South, and you mentioned words like okra and mojo, which are words that my ancestors used to use a lot, and we were big on okra and rice and stuff like that. From your experience being in the Deep South, are there any other cultures or traditions that were practiced in the Deep South that can be directly linked to Igbo land?
Yes. Here's an example. This has to do with religion, and and not just in the Deep South, but in the Upper South, was called conjure, which was related to what in the Caribbean was called obia.
Obia.
And which seems to be derived from, in large part, or at least in part, from Igbo obia. And here's one small example, and that is you want to influence somebody's actions, right? I don't want to say you want to curse them, but you want to influence their actions. And so in conjure in the South, you could put stuff into a clay pot and bury that pot. A conjure pot or a conjure gourd which is something that is very well known in what's called Dubia today, but in Ogbia, in this system of privileged knowledge, call it sacred science. And I can't remember the name of it. I'm actually looking it up here as I'm talking to you. Conjure bottles, things like cowrie shells. In archaeological sites in 18th century Virginia, and only in Virginia to any degree, not in the deep South, but in the upper South, in Virginia and the places that slaves were then taken from Virginia, like Tennessee and Kentucky. Archaeologists find cowrie shells that are not just anywhere, but they're in what are called root pits. People would dig holes into their earthen floors of their slave cabins, and that's where they would keep stuff. They would have different root cellars or root pits. The ones up by the fireplace was where they kept their sweet potatoes, their yams. And why do we call sweet potatoes yams? I mean, is there a connection with the fact that Igbo are the yam kings, and that to eat yam is so powerfully Igbo? Igbo neri ji. Igbo who eat yam. And to call them yams. But then also to keep things in there. And archaeologists find these cowrie shells. And cowrie shells, not just cowrie shells, but cowrie shells that the people themselves modified to cut them. Cowrie shells have a little hump on the back. If you actually look at a cowrie shell, you'll see that, a dorsal hump. But there are cowrie shells that are cut in order to cut that hump off, right? Now, why would somebody do that? You could do that so you could put the cowrie shell on a string, perhaps. But that cut cowrie is precisely known in Igbo land. It's used for divination in Dubia, in Ogbia. And here it shows up. There are examples of, in North Carolina, just where it should be, in fact, just where it is highly likely that Igbo were brought there as slaves. This is around Edenton. This is in eastern North Carolina, not far from Virginia, the border with Virginia. And on this site there, the archaeologists found a root cellar, a root pit, a square hole dug in the floor of the cabin, back along the back wall, back in the corner, a root pit that dates to the 1730s, 1740s, right? This was the high point. This was the height of the slave trade from Igbo land to Virginia. And in this cabin, North Carolina. This is in Virginia, outside of Williamsburg is what I'm talking about. In this cabin outside of Williamsburg, in Virginia in the 18th century, somebody placed very carefully the bottom of this like 1.5 foot square hole in her floor, 7 white scalloped shells arranged in a pattern on a carefully laid base of earth that was mounded up. Put these 7 white scallop shells together with 3 big cow bones from the femur, the big leg bone, and also from other large bones. And then purposefully filled in that hole. And when the archaeologists did this research, excavated it in the 90s, and they subjected it to scientific analysis, They analyzed the soil. They found a strange thing, and that is that there was a lot of grape tannin that was in that soil that had been filled in, that had been laid in all at once. And the interpretation of this is that this was a shrine. This was an ancestor shrine, perhaps to Ide Mili, which is just exactly what you would expect, to a shrine to the river goddess for protection, for consecration, right, perhaps. And as is done in villages and throughout Atlantic Africa, of course, but in Igbo land, libations to the ancestors, which involve now strong drink, brandy, right, or perhaps schnapps. I'm thinking an Arochukwu, for example. And this may well be evidence of an Igbo person trying to make sense of their world in the diaspora by calling on the protection of ancestral spirit. Now, these exact things did not continue. How could we expect them to? But it's the thinking and it's the trust in the trust that certain things work. So in 100 years later, in Tennessee, archaeologists have found these very curious little brass charms that people had that were in the shape of a hand or in the shape of a fist, a human fist, like. They're fist charms, these brass little that they have found on the plantation of President Andrew Jackson, called the Hermitage outside of Nashville. What did these things mean? They meant something. People had them. They were not related to Christian concepts. They were not crosses. They were not Indian. There's sort of no connection with Native American practice. And yet, if we remember Igbo, we remember the importance of Ikenga, the cult of the right hand, the cult of achievement, represented by the right hand. Then we must ask, well, is this a kind of Ikenga? We're not going to find Ikenga statues, and we shouldn't expect to. But we might well be able to interpret what we do find, something like these brass fist hand charms, by asking, might this not have an Igbo connection?
Very interesting.
So we think of well, another way to ask these kinds of questions is to ask, what is a pattern in one area versus a pattern in another area? And again, let's take North American history, U.S. history. In some parts of the South, it was expected that when a slave man and an enslaved woman were married and solemnized their marriage, that the wife would come and live with the husband. And this was particularly the case in South Carolina. And the masters would make arrangements, and it became a part of the plantation custom. The expectation was that, in fact, they would, switch off, that the masters would agree amongst themselves, because, in fact, enslaved people were not like robots in the fields. They had some leverage, and they knew it, and they were smart, and they were canny, and they negotiated for what they could get. But man and wife living together was the norm in places like South Carolina. In Virginia, it was not. In Virginia, the plantation custom was that husbands and wives would live separately, that they would be abroad spouses, abroad husband, abroad wife. That is, they would live on another farm, another plantation. part of this was because of the nature of slavery and the size of plantations in Virginia, which were relatively small, versus in South Carolina on these vast rice plantations, which were much larger. And yet also the fact of living separately from one's wife or one's husband has been thought of in terms of like the power dynamics of life under slavery, that a man did not want to live with his wife and have to see how she was treated, or a wife that would not want to actually live with her husband and who could not protect her, or she could not help him. Yes, no doubt, these were very real. And yet also the ancestral tradition among Igbo was for husbands and wives to live separate, to have their own house. It's unusual even now. I mean, it's notable when to live husband and wife in the same room, in the same bed, or at least it can be. But the point is, that ancestral traditional practice was people would have their own houses within the compound. And I wonder whether this wasn't transformed and introduced because it worked, because it did help.
Can you speak a little bit about the Igbo influence in the Caribbean?
Yes. And I think in the Caribbean, as we say in Jamaica and the Caribbean, you have more transparent contributions of Igbo to Jamaican culture, to Caribbean culture, because that's really where the vast majority of people were taken, and from whatever ethnic group, and from whatever region. I mean, the Caribbean was the center of the African diaspora, and we focus on North America because, after all, what happened later in America, the U.S., but the U.S. was always a very small sideshow. And so, and yet again, on Imobi, I need to make this point because people in Jamaica, for example, feel very strongly that they are fractured, that their sense of their cultural integrity was broken by slavery, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, that you've got cultural politics. Jamaica was the single most important destination for enslaved Igbo. Jamaica is the center of the Igbo diaspora historically.
Really? Interesting.
Wow.
And yet in Jamaica, people tend to want to focus not on Igbo in Jamaican history, but rather on another ethnic group, Akan, in the diaspora called Coromantee, who are from Ghana. Okay, and so and yet there are clear examples in much of the English-speaking Caribbean. The word for you, as me and you, is unu. And that is exactly Igbo. It is the Igbo word. It is a sign of the Igbo presence in the effect on language in the Caribbean. There are other examples. One that is a little slippery too is the word bakra. Bakra. Bakra is what slaves learned to call white people. Bakra is like the exact opposite of the N-word. You're with me? And which I'll say, because after all, whatever. So, white people learn to call black people niggers, and then black people learn to call white people bakra. And Bakra had that kind of power, that is the kind of power of a curse. Because Bakra, or Bakra, is from Efik, Mbakara. Mbakara is two words, Mba and Bakra. That is, those who surround, those who abuse. And it really means like devils. And it really means white folks, Bakra. And in Bakra, for example, in that Afro-Cuban masquerade that I mentioned, Abakwa, Mbakara is a type of masquerade. Mbakara is the masquerade who is the white man. Mbakara is white man in the masquerade of Abakwa. Mbakara, Bakra. There were, and so out of old Calabar, or today Calabar, and through basically Arochukwu, Calabar, and Bani on the coast were the two most important places where people were taken to the coast and then put on ships as slaves.
Okay.
And, someone like Equiano, Olud Equiano, who said he had never heard of white people. He had never seen white people before. He was amazed that there were these like strange people who he thought were spirits, and they must be spirits because they looked so strange. And he thought they were going to eat him. They had these big copper kettles on these ships, right, full of boiling things, and he thought that they were going to eat him. And but he had no name for white people, and in fact, Igbo had no single term for white people, right? So Anya Ocha, or Beke from Mwambeke, the children of Beke, and another term that escapes me at the moment, and one should imagine that Igbo and others who came through Calabar found out these people were called Mbakra, and then that kept with them the concept was useful. The concept of white folks as those who surround and abuse as basically devils. Why else? How else can we explain the fact that Bakra and variations of Bakra is a term that shows up widely in the English-speaking colonies, from Philadelphia in the 18th century through Virginia, down in South Carolina, and then throughout the Caribbean. Because again, I mean, why not the word abroni? Abroni, which is Twi from Ghana, would be the Coromante and means white person. But it doesn't have that sense of like white devil. I mean, I've been called Buck in Jamaica. Did I tell you a story?
Well, we actually, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, and I'm sure everyone has appreciated the wonderful information that you've given to us. We're going to have to bring you back for a second show.
Okay.
Most definitely.
I tend to get going.
Okay.
So let me leave with first of all, we begin with what we know, right? We begin with what is knowable. And so that means we begin with establishing connection through the slave trade. And then we move from what is knowable to what is discoverable, in explaining in attempting to explain what we find, what we're finding. Archaeology has become a very powerful tool for this, for opening up this world that existed that we just have the barest conception of, and things that archaeologists and others find, which before seemed just to be unexplainable. They just seem to be anomalous. They just seem to be outliers, hard to explain. How can you explain the fact that cowries show up all over the place in colonial Virginia but nowhere else in the South? Well, I think that this growing understanding that to move from what we know, which are the numbers of the slave trade, to what we can discover, which is what did it mean for different regions, and then to look at language, at food, at the words that people used for the things that they had, words and things, and then to move into ideas, and ideas about religion. I mean, conjure was the religion of the slaves. And I'll end with this, because we have this assumption in African American history, particularly in the United States, that Christianity was really one of the keys to understanding Black American culture historically. But here's the problem, and that is for several generations, perhaps well into the 19th century, maybe even as late as 1850, 1860, that perhaps the majority of people were not Christian. They had not converted to Christianity. They had not become Christian. Certainly in the 3, 4, 5 generations after, or let's say after the early 18th century, say for 100 years. Certainly before 1800, 1810, 1820, the vast majority of people in Virginia, which is what I discussed in this regard, were not Christian. If they were not Christian, what were they? And they were, and what we can say with certainty what they were not, and that is they were probably, or most quite likely not, simply nihilists, right, in believing in nothing. Because human beings just don't believe in nothing. Human beings believe in something. And if that something is hidden, there is adventure. And that's what I'm trying to do, is to uncover what was hidden. So I hope that your listeners find this helpful and useful and in fact intriguing, and I encourage people who have been listening or who will listen into this radio will then ask their own questions and begin their own research and start their own journey.
All right. Well, again, I'd like to thank you for coming on to the show. I'm supposed to thank, of course, my co-host and brother, Kobondo, people who called in, Chibueze, and the people in the chat, Papa Say, always showing support. And I'm going to close the show, as we always do, with the late, great Osita Osadebe, one of the songs from his Kedu America CD. All right. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.
All right. Good night. Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good night, you all.
Now in theaters, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Entertainment Weekly, USA Today, and critics everywhere are feeling the love for Book Club. It's a 4-star delight.
Let me introduce you to Christian Grey. Oh, no. Oh, wow.
Audiences everywhere are cheering for the funniest movie of the year. And now everyone can join the party. Diane Keaton, Jane Fonda, Candice Bergen, and Mary Steenburgen.
Happy reading, ladies.
Book Club, directed by Bill Holderman. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing.